Webinar focused on ASD and bullying with Jonathan Weiss, PhD, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology at York University in Toronto. My name is Matthew Lay, and I will be your host for today's broadcast. This webinar will review the ways of supporting youth who are experiencing bullying to increase their coping skills and to help stop the problem before it happens in the future. Today we're going to be addressing a number of points, including types and rates of bullying experienced by youth with ASD, best practices for counseling youth who have been bullied, and strategies for brief and effective consultations. Now, before we get started, as always, for those of you who have not been to an Autism Ontario webinar in the past, I'm going to take you through some logistics. First and foremost, we'll be pausing from time to time to take your questions. So you can submit your questions at any time as they come to your mind on the Ask a Question interface at the bottom of the webcast player that you're watching on right now. Now, not every question is going to be able to be answered. We have a number of people online today. And as such, what we will be doing is compiling those answers we can't get to, and we will be creating an FAQ afterwards. It is also important to note that when dealing with questions, we will be dealing with the essence of the question so that it's most relevant to the largest number of audience members. But quite often, too specific questions we're not able to address effectively in this format. Now, a couple other elements of the webcast interface that are of importance. To the side of us today, you will see slides that will be transitioning throughout the broadcast, adding more information to the discussion that I'll be having with Jonathan. Below that, there is a resource section. There, we'll be referring to it throughout the event, but it houses a link to the study that informed this presentation, the PowerPoint deck, as well as a number of other ministry and private sector resources to help assist you in better understanding the issues of bullying as it relates to ASD. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's get to why we're here today. I'd like to formally welcome Jonathan Weiss to the desk. Jonathan holds the Canadian Institute of Health Research Chair in Autism Spectrum Disorders, Treatment and Care Research. His research focuses on prevention and treatment of mental health problems in people with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disabilities. His research involves individuals, families, and the larger system of healthcare. And his studies impact of stressors such as bullying or transitions and how the cognitive behavior therapy can help in ASD. Of course, today we're here to talk about bullying and ASD, and I'd like to formally welcome Jonathan to the desk.
Great, thanks very much for having me.
So, first and foremost, most of our discussion today is taken from research, which is an ongoing collaboration with yourself and Catherine Cappadocia and Dr. Deborah Pepler of the York University. Can you talk a little bit about the collaboration?
Sure. As a clinician and a researcher and professor at York University, most of my research involves, as you mentioned, autism and mental health and promoting mental health. I'm not a bullying expert by trade, but I'm really fortunate enough to be at a university where we have someone like Deborah Pepler and her graduate students like Catherine who are really able to collaborate and kind of bring our different levels of expertise together. So I'm bringing the ASD expertise and they brought the bullying expertise for the research that we're doing.
Because Deborah Pepler is one of Canada's leading bullying experts,
Certainly,
I guess.
That's very fair to say.
Okay, so I understand why they did this study, but what drew you to it? Why did you get involved?
It's a great question and one that's rather close to my heart because you mentioned I do counseling with children with ASD to help them cope with anxieties. And I had a young man who I was working with who had lots of anxiety around school bells, homework, teachers, classrooms. And we're able to really teach him how to change his thoughts and how to act differently in the classroom to cope with lots of the anxieties he was feeling. And I felt if it's not too much to brag, I felt like we were having lots of success and I felt I was patting myself on the back. And the last thing we do in the process is I have him describe to me in almost role play, what's he going to do the next time he starts to feel anxious? And he went through it perfectly. It was gold stars all the way around. And then he said, and Dr. John, then the school bell will ring, and I'll go outside on the playground, and then the bully will be there, right? And then he tried his best to then think again all about those strategies that were working for really what we would call unrealistic kind of fears. You know, a fear of a school bell when there's really no danger associated with the bell itself, to a very realistic fear that I had neglected to really pay attention to, and it was a bit of a loss on how to address at the time. So that was my light bulb moment, if you will, and really informed the research questions that led to the study that I'll talk about today, and to my learning about strategies that can be helpful around bullying.
Okay. We have a diverse audience online, so what I like to do before we get into the stats and some of the strategies is create a baseline. So if you could define what bullying means in a way that we can all understand it.
So we often think, if I were to say to you, give me an example of bullying, right? You'd probably be very able to come up with an example. Many people probably in the audience as well have what they're already thinking about when we say bullying.
Yeah.
But overall, bullying is a relationship problem that involves then also solutions that have to do with relationships. Somebody who aims to bully others is learning about relationships during that process of how to use aggression and how to manipulate power in a way to feel powerful and take that from someone else. And someone who experiences bullying is also in that relationship, right? And is learning a lot about other people and what they expect and how their role is in those relationships. So it's really a relationship problem that involves power. In terms of, it can involve social status, it can involve, using different types of elements, like you're larger than me, right? So you might use that as a way to assert power.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I've never heard it referred to quite as a relationship, but I mean, I do know the old adage, meet me after school at 3 o'clock, I'm gonna, whatever, punch your lights out as a form of bullying. What does it actually look like? What are things that we can look for when talking about bullying?
Well, exactly. When we say bullying, whenever I ask people in an audience, give me an example, that's probably one of the first examples that comes up because it's so salient, right? Physical bullying.
Yeah.
The two most common forms, though, aren't physical. The two most common forms are social bullying, so using social networks as a way to exclude someone, as a way to devalue someone, right? Make somebody feel ostracized.
Right. You're not talking about Facebook when you say social networks, but
I mean actual physical social networks. We'll get the cyberbullying also. That's an increasingly prevalent kind of bullying, or way of using power, way of exerting yourself in a relationship in electronic means. And the other most common one is verbal, right? Using your words to devalue someone, to put somebody down. But these are all different methods or mechanisms, if you will, of achieving that same goal.
Okay. So those are common bullying forms, but I imagine that there are some that are more prevalent within youth with ASD.
That's right. Carol Gray of Social Story fame, Carol Gray wrote quite a while ago on taking an ASD lens, if you will, she says, to bullying. And she highlighted two additional forms, in addition to the other ones. It's important, they're not the only ones, but in addition to the ones that we typically expect when we think about bullying. One, backhanded bullying, and the definition's up there, but to give you an example of what it really looks like is, I like to give the example, 7-year-olds on the playground, right? We often, when people fight, when kids kind of fight, we say shake and make up, right? But I rarely see 7-year-olds when they go to greet their friends on a playground, greet them each with a handshake.
Right.
It's not something socially that we do, at least not nowadays. So if that were to happen, you might have a little social radar that would say something's off here. This is not social convention. Well, Carol Gray talks about backhanded bullying, and that example would be, well, maybe I say to you, hey Matt, come and shake my hand, right? There's nothing wrong in it, we're friends, and friends shake hands, right? So it's backhanded, right? It's using those rules of social convention as a way to put you in a vulnerable situation. And you shake my hand and I squeeze it really tight and I shake it and everybody laughs. And you feel awkward about it, but you're not necessarily even sure what happened or why it's wrong or how to talk about that with somebody else, because all I did was shake your hand.
Right.
So that's an example of backhanded bullying. And the other one that she talks about is using absurd requests. So where, again, if you're not picking up on the social norm or the social rules of what's safe and what's correct and what's not, you might not pick up on the absurd request as actually being something that you don't want to follow up on. So an example is a child who gets kicked off the bus for taking his shirt off, when what happened was that another person on the bus said, hey, Matt, let's play a game. Let's play shirts and skins. So I'll be shirts and you be skins, which is kind of what they do on, the playground. So the boy, that's an absurd request. But if you're not really picking up on those that it is, you might comply and say, okay, we're going to play this game. I'm belonging here, right? So they put you in that situation because of the request.
Okay. Let's talk about the study. Okay. So we heard the story that got you to that point, but when you started the study, what were you looking to understand? What was the focus?
So this study was our first kick at the can. It is published, and there's a lay summary of it that people can easily access.
That's in the resource center on our webcast, as well as Autism Ontario's website.
That's right, as well as a blog that we have on ASD and mental health. And the link will be up at the end. But this was our first kick at the can of saying, all right, what can we start to learn about rates of different types of bullying in ASD? Not simply does it happen or doesn't it,
right.
but what about social and verbal and physical, all of those specific types? And then what's the relationship like between experiencing bullying and one's mental health? Anxiety, depression, anger, emotional difficulties in this population, in youth with ASD. These things had been looked at in typically developing youth without ASD, but nobody had yet done it with this lens in mind.
Okay. So I think there's a slide that talks a little bit about the study and how you went about it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, just to highlight, this was, again, our first kick at the can, right? Not our last. So what we did is we went to parents, right? And we said to parents, through Autism Ontario and other like-minded advocacy groups and across the country, and we said, we want to do a study, a survey on bullying experiences with youth with ASD. So this isn't necessarily representative of every child with ASD out there at all. This was people who had something to share around bullying in ASD who wanted to participate in it. In the end, we had about 200 individuals who participated in the data that we used out of a much larger sample, actually. And what was really telling about this was how quickly people responded.
Wow. Really,
families responded. Usually you have to recruit over many months for surveys, and people could respond online, or they could fill out paper and pencil, or they could call in, which didn't happen often, but it was an option. This really filled up really rather quickly, within a couple of months. People really had a lot to say. I won't go into all of the specific details of who was in the sample, because I think it's more interesting and important to talk about the results and then strategies.
So let's do it. Let's get to the meat. Let's look at some results and see what you found.
Well, overall, we asked, again, this is a study where we were saying, tell us about bullying experiences. So it doesn't necessarily represent every student with ASD at all. But within that, we said, who's been bullied within the last month? And the majority had been bullied within the last month, 77%. And of that group, about half had been experiencing that bullying for at least a year. So this isn't just an isolated element. This is often something that's occurring that can be happening for quite a long amount of time. And then when we looked at the graph that people could see here, it's just a nice way of showing the proportion of the sample that might have, how much they expect, the frequency of experiencing it in the last month. And what they can see is about a quarter hadn't experienced it in the last month, but a larger amount experienced it more than 2 times in the last week. Which means that when we're talking about bullying, and when we hear about one example of bullying, what I like to say is that you have to check for more, because likely this is the tip of the iceberg.
Is that, I mean, I know you're not the overall bullying expert, but is that common in the general population when a youth experience bullying, that they're going to 30% of them would experience it that much, or did you find it a little higher with your sample group?
You know, I can't compare to what others have found in terms of the frequency of bullying. I do know that there is a range of bullying, and it does happen chronically in youth without ASD. And a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of the findings that we actually found here, are not necessarily exclusive to youth with ASD. Right? But I think this is the first time anybody's had that conversation and looked at it with youth with ASD in mind.
So what's some of the other findings that we
So bullying, verbal and social bullying were the most common forms, as it is found in the general population, with the same kind of high frequency. And physical bullying was about 40%, which is very high. What was interesting is I expected cyberbullying to happen more frequently than it did in my hypothesis, because we know that many youth with ASD have a real interest in electronics and an interest in using computers, even as a way to communicate, if not to access topics of interest,
writing, things
all
like
of that, or to YouTube. And so I was talking to a number of parents, and I bet there are some parents already online who are answering. They know why it's only at 10%. And one parent stood up at a talk and said, you know, to be bullied online, you have to be connected to others online. And again, we need to do more research in this, but I thought that was very telling, that it wasn't necessarily a social reason for being online.
Yeah, for sure.
So these slides, I think the next few slides is about that second goal of looking at a relationship between experiencing bullying and mental health issues, challenges with anxiety, depression, anger. And what we did find was a relationship with the more frequently someone was experiencing bullying, the more severe parents reported emotional difficulties. And what I like to show about the slide that people are looking at now around the severity of specific problems, what's important to note is conduct problems, anxiety, and oversensitivity really has to do with that walking on eggshells experience, right? The idea of being overly sensitive to situations, not simply about sensory experiences, but in each one of these different types of challenges or difficulties, the more frequently someone experienced bullying, the more severe these issues were. And we really saw a jump too when it came to that chronic bullying, though the none or 1 to 3 times versus once a week to 2 or more times a week. We saw a much larger jump.
So I've sat on this desk with other experts talking about different situations, and I think what you're saying, and it's really important to note, is that although children on the spectrum may experience more anxiety than those who aren't in general, this could be a precursor to that your child or youth is being bullied if you see that growing, because we're looking at this very clearly, that those who are being bullied, oversensitivity, anxiety, and conduct problems are all increasing.
Right, and we don't know which way this goes, right? The chicken and the egg, right? This was just a snapshot in time.
Right.
So we don't know if the bullying leads to which way, or if it's a cyclical thing, where bullying leads to more anxiety, which leads to more bullying. We don't know that yet, not in this kind of research. But what we do know clearly is that in any situation, and this is where I was really interested in bullying as a particular trauma or stressor, that there are other stressors and traumas out there as well, right, that kids can experience, going through transitions, for example. But whenever we see a large shift in a child's emotional expression, we have to ask, what are new things going on? Are there changes in that child's life? And one could be peer changes and peer challenges, like bullying.
Right. So,
and just to say that, I don't think we have to go through all of these kind of in a lot of detail, but the point of a number of these slides is the same, is that no matter which way we looked at it, there was this relationship between experiencing bullying and emotional challenges.
Right, makes sense. At this point in time, I want to remind everyone out there that they can submit their questions or their comments online. I do have a question that's come through to me already, and I think this may be something that would be better dealt with later during strategies. But the question that has just come through is, what do you do in situations where a child's ASD diagnosis hasn't been disclosed to his or her classmates?
It's a really common question that people have, both educators and family members. And the concern is, well, should we talk about it or shouldn't we? And how will that relate to bullying? Right. In this context, I do think it's an individual decision that needs to be made. Families need to be comfortable with that, and educators need to be comfortable with talking about it. I like to refer people to Autism Ontario's resources when it comes to talking about autism in the classroom. They have excellent resources on doing just that for youth of different ages, right? Of ways of talking about autism in the classroom. There are other resources as well that are quite available for that when the time is right to do that. I do like, when it comes to bullying, to also mention to people, or ask this question to people. I say, even without the label, kids are very good at picking up on differences, on picking up on people's, how other kids are acting. They don't need a label to notice that or to exploit it if they really wanted to. And they'll find their own explanations for why someone's acting the way that they are.
And I guess, getting to the root of the question is that families made a decision not to disclose. But I think what we'll find later, because I've got a sneak peek of what we'll be talking about, is that the strategies that you're going to talk about later, they're relevant for youth on the spectrum and youth not on the spectrum experiencing bullying, and so
that's right.
A lot of the same practices should come into play.
That's right. I love numbers. I'm a psychologist, and we're not going to see any more numbers, so people should be pretty happy about that. But the one number that is a little bit made up that I like to say to people is think that 80% of what you already know how to do to help children feel safe and to address bullying, those are the same strategies that can be helpful for kids on the spectrum. And vice versa. The things we learn about how to support kids with socio and communicative difficulties, diversity issues, kids with learning difficulties, the better we are at supporting them in their issues around school or around bullying, for example, the better we're going to be at helping all students.
And on that note, you love stats. The stats are there. There is a synopsis of this research. So if you do want to dig in just a little bit deeper, you can go to the resource section and you can go ahead and grab that. I got one more question I'm going to ask, and then let's move on if we can. What are the kinds of situations at school where bullying is most likely to happen. How can we as parents support our children during these times? It's a big question, where they are likely to be bullied. After school on the playground, the most relevant answer?
Well, you read my mind.
Yeah.
So not necessarily after school,
Right.
but the playground is a clear place that we have to pay a lot of attention. But why the playground? There's a number of reasons for that.
Right.
One is that it's an unstructured social situation, rather than other types of social situations that are more structured around a specific activity or problem, for example, right? Kids are more on their own in that situation, and there's often less supervision in terms of the ratio of adults to child might be different than in the classroom in the context, right? There's more places where people can't, where their eyes aren't,
right?
So there's a lot of places, but let's extrapolate that a bit. Some other high-risk situations are often places like the change room, for example, to pay attention to. If they're changing, for example, for gym, right, to pay attention to that.
Because of less supervision or the more exposure that would go along with it?
Well, both of those, right? Kids are more uncomfortable in that situation. They're in closed quarters. They could be acting out and kind of getting a bit hyper as well. This is a gym class now, as well as less supervision in that kind of environment. So to pay attention to any situation like that, as well as transitions, right? Again, is hard a lot for kids with ASD already, but it's a time when people, bullying can happen very quickly. It doesn't need a huge build-up, and it doesn't have to happen for 10 minutes as an episode, right? It can happen really quickly.
So
Kids are very good at
from
getting
one
it
classroom to another.
Exactly, those kinds of transitions. I don't mean from elementary school to high school, for example. So those are often very high-risk situations, but that doesn't exclude other kinds of situations, like being in the classroom and experiencing it in the classroom, because it still does happen there.
Okay. Well, you can see the tone of the questions already. People are looking to get to the strategies. Before we move away from the findings, is there anything else that you want to address?
Well, there is one finding that I find very interesting that we have to do a lot more research on.
Okay.
But this was something we quickly looked at, which was the relationship between experiencing bullying and perpetrating bullying. And what we found was that 53% of the youth who were reported to experience bullying had also, parents were saying they also bullied someone else.
Oh, wow.
Right? So this is according to the parents' report, of course, right? But when we asked them, does your child also engage in bullying, that 53%, whereas only 14% of the youth who did not experience any bullying themselves as a victimization perpetrated it. So there's this relationship. It's not a one-to-one, it's not perfect, and we don't know, again, why that's happening or which comes first. But what I like to say is that, or what this tells me as a clinician, is that if somebody says, oh, my child with ASD has been bullying someone else, one of the first things I ask myself is, have they experienced bullying themselves?
Yeah. Did you find, I'm not sure if it would come out in this study, but if you found that a lot of parents with youth on the spectrum don't know their kids have been bullied?
Well, I think a lot of parents are very good at knowing what's happening with their kids. They have a relationship with their children. They're sensitive to those kinds of changes that you talked about, right? And they're really important in terms of people as advocating on behalf of their children. So I do think they're actually quite good often at knowing what's happening with their kids. But for every child, just because, for example, in this study, just because parents might not know that their child was bullied in the last month doesn't mean it hasn't happened. Some kids with ASD do have challenges with communicating, right? Of course, it's part of the diagnosis, so they might not be able to communicate what's happening with them in the classroom in the same way. Or, especially think about adolescents, a lot of times teens in general, don't want to share. Right, with their parents either. So we have to recognize that that's also possible for kids on the spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to win those people as friends rather than getting them in trouble.
I don't want parents to know. I want this to be separate. I want to deal with it on my own. All these different reasons.
Okay, so let's. I want to get into strategies now.
Sure.
This is a big part of the presentation today, and a big part of the reason why we have so many people online. But before we do, we always like to start with, and your presentation does a good job of this, is talk about some of the myths associated with it.
So again, when this is something that I learned about, this has been a wonderful learning process for me.
Okay.
Kind of taking the results and then saying, what's our next step? So part of this has been what other people have written about, like Carol Gray of Social Story fame, who's written about bullying and taking that ASD lens. And she said, these are myths. I want people to know, because they're up here, these are not facts.
Right.
These are not the truths of it. You know, I had one parent very angry with me because there's a little misunderstanding there. Yeah. These are things we have to be aware of. If we're going to have these conversations, like professionals and parents together, is anybody holding on to these?
Yeah.
Okay, because we have to educate before we're going to implement. These are barriers to successful implementation. Okay. So a few of them that are really important. One is that because somebody has a diagnosis of ASD means that they're doomed to be bullied. It's inevitable, and that's really not the case. I think we have to hold the opposite assumption. And the content of the bullying is the reason why people are bullying. So just because Sam loves fish doesn't really mean, and that's the content, oh, we're making fun of Sam because she's interested in fish, and that's going to be what we're going to be, maybe we call her names like fish face or something like that. Yeah. That doesn't mean that that's really the reason, the core cause of the bullying.
Right.
Right? We could get rid of that, and that leads to the next myth. We could address that let's say, interest,
yeah.
right? But kids will find other things to use, right?
Yeah.
That's just the content. It's a relationship issue. That's the reason.
And heaven forbid you address that that content, and you're taking away something from a child that they enjoy and you know, thrive with.
What's the message there that we're saying to kids, right? Is it's not okay to be who you are,
right?
It's not okay to be you. Now, that's not to say that if somebody has an intense interest and it's causing interference in their lives, or that it's not important to help people expand their interests,
yeah.
or address some of those things. That's very important too. But we don't want a message to be, you're the reason why you're being bullied. It's because of the way you are,
yeah.
or the way that you act, or the things that you like and enjoy,
yeah.
right? So we really have to shift the focus from that.
Okay.
Once a child with ASD or their school has received an anti-bullying program, well, that's all we can do, and let's hope for the best. You know, that's a real myth. Bullying prevention and intervention is what I've been learning is an ongoing process.
Right.
So there is a necessary place for school-wide programs. There's a necessary place for classroom-focused programs when it comes to anti-bullying. There's no doubt. But just because someone comes in and does that doesn't mean the job is done. That's laying a foundation for the ongoing work of maintaining healthy relationships and keeping kids safe.
Yep. Not your area of expertise. I'm not going to ask you to talk too much about it, but I guess it is important to note that there are programs like this. In case parents don't know that. There are, as you said, school-wide classroom programs. Okay.
And it might come up in the FAQs afterwards where I could provide some of those links to others. Like you said, it's not an area of direct research of mine, but they do exist. And schools do use them at a school-wide level and a classroom-wide level.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of these resources are available through the work that Dr. Pepler does with her organization, PrevNet.
Right.
And there will be a link on coming up in a couple of slides.
Yeah, and our resource section right now, PrevNet is on there. There's also ministry resources on there, which may not be exactly what we're talking about, but I'm sure will help you get there.
So the last kind of thing that I'll bring up, again, I think it's very necessary, which is supervision and teacher supervision.
Right.
But A, we can't put all of the responsibilities on teachers to supervise this problem away. And B, even if we did, we don't have enough eyes out there to supervise every situation all the time. Right? So we have to think about addressing bullying that involves supervision but requires a lot more as well.
Okay. So again, guys, these are myths and not
that's right.
These are barriers for us to help improve. And now let's move into tips and strategies and intervention really for when this is happening.
So I did glance over a slide just now, and the only thing to say about that slide, it still is really about, is that it's really important that people take away that the responsibility for addressing these problems shouldn't lay on any one person.
Right.
Most notably the child with ASD, right? We want to teach them some skills. We want to teach them different ways of acting, and we'll get to that. But it's really important that we recognize that if we're going to address this, that it requires a child, but it requires the family to be involved, parents, and it requires educators to be involved. Right? That's really only by having a full team approach, if you will, and this will come up repeatedly on a few slides.
Not only on a few slides. slides, it comes up. And many parents are aware of this. I mean, it comes up in the learning plans. It comes up in everything. This team is so important. The collaboration.
And it's part of a provincial policy, as well. You know, like everyone recognizes the importance, the need for that if we're going to actually address bullying. But let's get to some of those tips and strategies that we're talking about.
All right. So to start off with, intervention overall.
So again, here's that website at PrevNet that I go to when I'm looking for resources often around bullying, and I really like these 5 general pieces of advice for any parent. When your child is talking to you about bullying, right? This is emotional for them, and it's emotional for you. So take a deep breath. Right, take time to process your own feelings if you can before acting, before reaching out. Right, take that time. Or if you approach professionals with a lot of anger in yourself because it's upsetting, right? It's going to create a lot of barriers to actually rather than collaborative problem solving. We know that the warmer you can be and the more sensitive you can be when you're listening to your child talk about this, the more they're going to be able to cope with it. Right. So being able to respond sensitively to what they're bringing to you, rather than dismissing it, is often a recommended thing that can be helpful. Right. It helps children stay resilient. As well, try to gather information in writing.
So around the last one, I just want to say something. Like, I mean, is it a fine line for parents? Is it a concern about coddling versus empowering there, or in your mind, in your experience, the more sensitivity that you can bring to a situation like that, the better for the youth?
Well, in my experience, if a child's experience, if they've been bullied, and they're able to, and they want to talk about it, right? If we might be concerned that we're coddling with them, but I think what the literature shows is if we listen to them and we respond based on what they're saying, they're more able to talk about and be assertive and talk about their problems in a healthy way, rather than the message being that what you've experienced or the thoughts you're having about it isn't important. Right? So I could see where that adage comes from, but I don't think the literature supports approaching kids in that way if they've experienced trauma.
Right. Okay.
So we'll get into a couple of slides around interventions, one of them being how to gather information. And it is important to try to gather information about the bullying from your kids. Write it down. Right? Take a few notes if you can, so that you can reflect on it and share that later. And again, develop and work with a team. And think about who can be on your child's safety team. Now, this isn't safety in the sense of making sure kids don't fall down. This is around bullying. Bullying safety,
and
if you will.
Safe
feeling
at
safe.
School.
Exactly. So who can be part of your child's team to help your child feel safe?
Who's most commonly part of that team?
So there are 3 educators that are often in part of the team. If your child has an educational assistant, the teacher in the classroom, and often the administrator, so a vice principal or principal, can be involved in that team. I've seen other situations where the bus driver is involved, for example, in the team, right? Because that's a high-risk situation for a particular youth. But typically those other 3 can, and when they are involved, things go really well. What's really important is that it's more than one person, more than one educator, because what if that person's not there that one day, right? It's important that that child knows who they can come and talk to. It's a much better message than go talk to an adult. Right? Pick the people, let them know that they're, get them on board with this. Once they know that they're there to listen, they're going to be more receptive, and the child knows where to go to, especially a child with ASD.
Makes sense.
So this is actually one of the interventions. The first intervention that I'll highlight is how one goes about collecting information with kids.
Which has got to be challenging. I know I talked to my kid, I asked him what he did today, and he can barely remember. And, and it takes 5 days later, he tells me something about what happened that day, and I'm always blown away by how challenging the recall is at a young age. But, and you're saying write a letter. How do you go about doing that?
So it's definitely not to just put a piece of paper down in front of your child, asking them to start them off with dear and let them finish, right? This is a structured way. We talk about writing a letter, but it can, I guess, look like that if a child loves to write letters. But more often what we recommend is using a template to structure what somebody's communicating, especially somebody who might have social and communication difficulties. You mentioned how difficult or challenging it is to get something out of someone, the recollection piece. So using a template is really, really helpful, and I'll talk about it for many reasons. Especially, so here's an example of template that's off of the PrevNet website. They also now have done it where you can input the information online and click print and it prints it out as a PDF. But it's just an example of using a template to help children write a letter. I like this for many reasons. One is that if your child's talking about bullying, that's emotional for them.
Yeah.
And if you just open it up and say, tell me what happened, they'll think about the most salient piece of the story, so he hit me. But they might not think about the other aspects of bullying that were happening in the same event, like the social or verbal.
Yeah.
Right? It might be emotional for you, and it might be hard for you to hear all of this and stay sensitive and do all of those things, rather than jump right to how do we solve the problem.
Right.
So this helps slow parents down, the listener down. It helps me as a clinician slow down to say, okay, let's make sure that we talk about or check in on all the different types of bullying.
Small point, semantic maybe, but you're saying the child write the letter. In your experience, whether the parent helps, the child fills it in online, or the youth fills it in online, it goes to the principal and or educator from the child or from the parent?
So this is a good point. I did say child writes the letter, but it's never done. I've never done it in isolation. I've never given a child the letter to fill out on their own. It's always done in a process where I'm helping them. Sometimes I write it for them. Sometimes they write it and I help guide them. Sometimes I'm more an observer depending on their ability levels. And then who gives it is something that is then, what I often do is I talk with the child about it and we make a decision.
Okay.
Who should give this? Should I be giving this to your teacher? Should I be giving this to your principal? Often I make you can make copies and give it to both, of course, right? Yeah. But then who gives it? Often again, even though we might give it to the child and be with the child when they give it to the teacher and principal.
But does the child own it in that it's their letter to the educator, or is it, Dr. John did it? I did it with my,
this is coming from them, and that's what we want in terms of the experience, not something that's coming with my name at the end of it. So their name's on it, and they're holding on to it. Hopefully, if they can, right? This ASD is a spectrum, and some kids might not be able to do that and might not experience that. But if they can, and they're comfortable with it, then it helps them share their story.
And I imagine a byproduct, I mean, templates are always great, but a byproduct too would be the empowerment that would go along with that, eh?
Right, the empowerment and feeling heard. Right? If you have problems feeling heard, because it's hard for you to put words to your thoughts and your experiences, then this can help with that. And it can be adapted in many different ways. It can be more sophisticated than this, with more verbose language, with highly detailed points. I had one child that added frequencies to each one of these things, another child who added severity, for example, because they really wanted to add the detail. They owned it, as you said. Other kids, it's almost entirely visual. Right? And we're using pictures to show it, and it's simply a circle around the pictures that they recognize, for example. Right? So we can adapt it for different developmental levels and different ability levels and different interests. I had one child, for example, who really was very interested in Mario and Luigi, right? From I think it's Nintendo, right? So we had something like this, but all around the page was kind of done with Mario and Luigi and the same kind of font that they used in the video game, right? To make it not enjoyable, but to really fit with their interests and who they are as a person.
Well, once again, this document can be found on PrevNet, and as well as the online forum that you mentioned. We talked about the team, we've talked about the greater, I mean, there's more than just parents on here, and one of the things that that needs to be done is we need to increase awareness about the bullying. So can you talk a little bit about some strategies about increasing awareness?
So this is about increasing awareness for the child to be aware of more safe and less safe areas in their school, as well as for those authority figures in the school.
To recognize where it might happen.
Right, exactly. So Carol Gray suggests drawing a map of the school with either only high-risk locations, or sometimes it's locations and time. The one that people see here is just an example. It doesn't look like a map, right? It's just a table, but it has the different locations that are relevant to that child and different times of the day that are relevant to that child. And in there, the example that it has here is easy or safe situations, situations that don't where the child's saying, no, it doesn't happen here, it doesn't happen here, oh, it happens here. This is where it happens a lot.
Right.
And all of a sudden, we're starting to get safe, unsafe, or easy, medium, hard. The language is like you said before, semantics. It can be tailored for the individual person. Other children really do want to see that visual map of the school, and we can do that instead of having like a table.
Right.
The point of it is all the same, no matter how it's adapted, and that's to help the child recognize safer areas and where things happen a lot, as well as the authority figures.
Anecdotally, for your experience, youth on the spectrum, chart or physical map, what do you find is better for you?
I've seen the gamut. I've seen again very highly detailed tables, and I've seen pictures, literally pictures of the school with circles on it of their actual school, right? And needing to see things as concrete as that.
Okay.
Right? And things in between.
It's like most things, it comes down to knowing your youth and personalizing the.
That's right. Your child, your student, and making it fit with them and their skill level.
Okay. So it's not just about the child, as you said. It's not just about the educator. It's not just about the parent. We talked about the team. You've touched on this a little bit, but can you go into a little bit more detail about identifying that team and working with that team?
Right. So it can be a diverse team. It doesn't have to just be those three that I highlighted before. So there's many people that can be involved. Whoever you feel is able to help and is in that child's life, especially regularly, can be involved in their own way. But what's really important is that whatever ways people are involved, they're clear about what their goals are. Right?
Okay.
What's the reason that they're involved in the safety team? So really map that out. Is it to actually address bullying in the school? Certain people can do that, and it's certain people's responsibilities to say address the whole climate of the classroom. Right? That might be a very different person than, as I mentioned before, making sure that the bus is a safe place.
Right.
Right? Or that we've allocated enough resources to the playground for supervision, which might be administrator's role. So people might have different roles to play as part of the team. And we've listed a number of different potential goals here that a person might have as being part of that team.
Bigger the team, the better, or does that just turn into go speak to an adult? Or is there a size that you would recommend?
So I don't have any data to kind of highlight this, but I've seen very strong teams that were 3 people and very strong teams that were 6 people and 7 people. It has more to do with the culture of the people that are there and their interest and recognition of how important this is that I think matters than the size.
Okay, great. Next that we want to talk about is something we hear constantly as an intervention technique for children on the spectrum is teaching communication skills. Talk about the importance of that when it relates to bullying.
Well, I mentioned before that bullying it's emotional, right? Everybody knows that. I think it's an assumption that's well placed. And when you're asking somebody to talk about bullying, they might be very good, a kid with ASD might be very good at talking to a specific person in a specific location, like talking to their vice principal at school about what just happened, but then they're not sharing that at home, right? Cross contexts. Or they might be able to talk about it with their parent, but not necessarily able to share with their administrator. So we have to help a child, and the template can help with this, right? That's another way to share. We don't have to use our words to constantly have to relive a bullying experience, right? We can use that template and say, this is what happened to me.
Great. And next up, we see individual response strategies. This goes back to a little bit to what I was saying about the map versus the document about what works better. But can you speak about the importance of this within dealing with bullying?
So this is where we're getting to really practical, what can we do the next time that bullying happens, right? For a specific child, that's part of the solution for sure, and that's where people always go to first. Is what can I get you're the child, to do differently? Right? So it is important, and that starts with understanding what bullying is, about defining it in a way that is appropriate to that child's level, a way that they understand. We never want to just do that. So now we've increased their awareness that it's happening, but we haven't given them any skills to get out of it yet, right? So we want to do both.
Well, let's talk about defining bullying to a youth, because I imagine your first definition about relationships, something I'd never heard before, wouldn't necessarily work. So talk to me about how you help define bullying to youth.
So I try with youth with ASD when I'm trying to talk to about this, I try to be as concrete as possible, using examples rather than the theoretical definition, if you will. So I put an example here, and using visuals along, if they're younger especially, or very concrete, using visuals along with also pictures, along with kind of writing in text that they can read, rather than just talking using our words. So here's an example that I've used before. So some students try to bully others by, making them feel uncomfortable, frightened, sad. So really the actions of bullying, rather than the underlying definition of it, is a way that kids they're better able to connect to. So, they try to bully others, and then giving lots of different examples so they can get a sense of all the different ways that it can look.
So you're educating, and at the same time, you're increasing their awareness so they can think about all the various places where it could affect them, or they could have been affected.
Right. Or recognizing others as well, because bullying often happens with bystanders around.
Right.
So it can also help for that reason.
Yep. Seeing it in others. Okay.
But it's not enough to just increase that awareness.
Right. Okay. And then from there, we talk about the team. And we've talked about this just a little bit, but go back, if we can go through this, I think it's...
So I think this is really important for people, to know, is that it's what I call the parachute plan.
Okay.
It doesn't stop bullying necessarily from happening again. It's what can you equip a child who's experiencing it to think, to say out loud, and to do in that moment that gets them out of that situation without adding fuel to the fire, right? Or making the situation worse for them, right? Because it's happening now. How can we get them from that unsafe situation to a more safe situation? Because often kids with ASD might be stuck in a situation because they don't know how best to respond, right? So this is part of that plan. But it's really important that part of the do in this is going to talk with people on that safety team.
Okay.
Right? They need to know who they can go and talk to, more than just go talk to an adult. Okay? But this really is, and you can use social stories or scripts, for example, written out to plan this in advance, rather than trying to coach somebody through an actual experience. Map it out, get it almost automatic before the child's in that situation again.
Right.
So as an example, what I like to do is I also like to use a checklist, because people, when I've worked with kids with ASD and I say, well, what if you just opened it up and said, what should you do the next time somebody's bullying you, right? It might be very hard for you to generate new solutions to something that you feel helpless about. So here's another handout that's from PrevNet, but it's just an example for school-age youth, and there's one for adolescents as well, for example, that looks slightly different, that I've gone through with kids and circled the elements that will work for them. So kids could pick the statements that they want to think to themselves, or the things that they want to do that they really buy into. Right? You don't need to use all of them, but the idea is to have one thing that you can think to yourself, one mantra almost, that you can think to yourself that's also automatic, that you can say, and then one thing you can do.
As a parent, I imagine that, now 45 minutes into the presentation, that this is the kind of stuff that I would want to jump to, because my child may be experiencing bullying, and I want to know all the various. I think it's important that you took us through this point where you start with the education, you make sure you have the team in place. These are all parts of the process before we get into necessarily addressing things right away. When it does happen, though, you've got a great thing. It was a couple slides ago. It says what to think, what to say, and what to do. This is the process we want the youth to go through. I'm going to challenge you when we talk about what to think, and you've got some great things on the screen about what we should do. What are some of the things that would be natural for a youth to think when they're in a bullying situation versus what they should be thinking?
Well, so in terms of what somebody might be thinking, what a child might, and it's going to be individual, but children might think something like, this is unfair, I'm going to hurt you back.
Right.
Oh no, it's happening again, there's nothing I can do about it. Right? These are some of the thoughts. They might have images of what they're expecting that's about to happen. right, going through their head. All those negative, distressing images of what they've experienced before, for example.
Right.
Right. This is really going to hurt. They're going to laugh at me. All of those catastrophic thoughts.
Other than staying calm when they're in a very stressful situation, what are things we want them to be thinking?
So it could be something. It could be one statement or a mantra that really says, this is not my fault. This is his problem. Or, I'm not alone. Other people go this through. Whatever helps that child kind of stay more calm, but also stay a bit more resilient in that situation.
How do you define that on a per child basis? What have been your experiences?
So again, it's about having almost what I've done is often I have a list of different examples. And I say, lots of kids, to help them stay calm, to help them in this situation,
Right.
they might think something like this. For example, let's go through these together, and we look at it on the paper, and then which one would you want to pick to help you stay calm? And then they pick the one that hopefully is there, or they generate. I often have blanks, and then after we've gone through a whole list of examples, they can then fill in the one that might not be there that they want to think about.
Right. Okay, so they're thinking about it.
I think that
they're calming, and now they have to say something.
Right, and now it's not like you're thinking about it and letting the person continue to do what they're doing, for example. It's just that immediate thought rather than the alternative that you were asking about before.
Right.
They've thought that, okay, what do you say, right? Usually there's going to be some type of response, and you mentioned before what could be a natural one. Well, I'm sure a lot of parents could answer that. Swear word, swear word, swear word. I'm gonna kill you. Right?
Yeah.
Threat. Right, like using anger and aggression as a response, right? But we want to help them avoid those kinds of responses for more proactive or assertive ones that don't fuel the fire. So I'm out of here, for example, or whatever, or you need to stop. These are all, again, you can pick the one that works for that child, for their context. All are ways of just immediately responding and not making a situation worse.
Right. And this must take a little bit of practice,
Yeah.
right? To get to be, changing the automatic thought that is to get angry, changing that. I even see here you've got some stuff about how to say it. So you've got a bully in front of you and you want to stay in control when maybe the bully isn't. So I can imagine this takes some work. This is stuff that obviously you teach when you're counseling or you work with youth. Is this a long process to get through most times, or I know it's individual, but
it is individual, and I think it's not something necessarily that parents need to do alone.
Okay.
If they're working the process, educators can help kids as well do this, right?
Right.
They can work together to do this. In fact, I would imagine that working together across home and school would help it generalize even more and be more effective. It doesn't necessarily have to be a long process.
Yeah.
It depends on people's rate of learning and their ability to really buy into it, right? The practice is what's really important, though. We know that if kids are able to practice these kinds of techniques, then it'll become automatic, because it needs to be almost automatic for the next time they're in that situation.
Oftentimes you talked about practicing without using the real scenario.
That's right,
because of the
course.
emotional connection, and that goes with this as well,
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So we know what they are supposed to be thinking, saying, and now what do they do?
So this is, really how do they get out? How do they get out of the situation? That's the do here. We don't want to get drawn into a back and forth, a power battle, or an actual fight, for example. If we don't help kids sometimes will react, and some parents will say, well, this is absolutely fine, which is, if my child's being threatened, he stands up for himself, and he maybe he punches the kid out, right? Well, then that'll teach that guy to not go after him again. And maybe that's true. Maybe that person stops targeting your son or daughter.
Right.
But it also, in a zero tolerance situation, if we get into a yelling match and I hit you, who gets into trouble?
The person who hits, right?
So I've lost my temper, even though I was being bullied, and I'm the one in trouble.
Right.
So it's often a problem to react in that way. So what can we do? It's hard. Walking away is hard. It's not an easy thing. I get that. But what can we do to help kids walk away where they can report what's happening to those adults that we've identified? And I think it's important. Lots of times kids won't want to do this because they feel like it's tattling, and nobody wants to be a tattletale.
Yeah.
Right. But I really like the line. It's come up. I've learned is reporting gets someone out of trouble. Tattling is trying to get someone into trouble. And lots of kids really get that distinction. right? You're reporting what's happening to you or even to somebody else that you're seeing, right? Because they're in trouble and you have to help them or you have to help yourself, right?
Yeah.
You're not just doing it purposefully to walk around finding to get other people into trouble.
Right.
And that's a difference that I think is important to me.
Okay, so now we're moving into a bit of a time management situation. We got 10 minutes left. I do want to ensure that we're answering questions from our online audience. There's a lot of people out there. I've got one right now. I'm going to encourage you to submit your questions, and then we'll move on to some preventative steps. So the one question that I have here is it always kids without ASD doing the bullying? I mean, you talked a little bit already about those who experience bully more, but can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually, in our research, when we asked people who was doing it, what parents reported was that, like, doing the bullying to their child. We heard everything from typically developing youth in their classroom, older kids in the school setting, and also other kids with special needs or exceptionalities, right? Other kids with ASD as well, and some depending on the classroom environment. So it wasn't. And we haven't looked at, we need to look at it more in terms of the different rates, but it wasn't exclusively youth without ASD who were bullying necessarily youth with ASD.
Okay. Are there situations where bullying should be ignored? Example, victim is not upset, no social consequences to the victim. Can there even not be social consequences?
Right. So it's I don't think bullying in that kind of example is something that needs to be ignored, but maybe you don't start in that situation by making that child aware of the bullying and what they do. Maybe if you're noticing that bullying is happening, it's saying, okay, where's the context? How do we address this anyways? Right? Because if it's happening, if it's happening to that child, it's likely happening to other children in that same environment, right? So that it's almost a warning. And B, even if that child might not be aware of it, doesn't mean it's necessarily not impacting them in a negative way.
And I think that rolls nicely into this next question, which is, I mean, I would imagine that if you're not being ignored, and maybe a bit of the some of the social issues recognized, if you're not recognizing the bullying, right, and you're thinking maybe just ignore it, it may be because the child is not recognizing it. And it says here, question is, what about the child who is not aware they are being bullied, particularly backhanded bullying? How do you help them to be able to recognize that these individuals are not being their friend and stand up for themselves?
Yeah. So the first part, the recognition part, right? Sometimes what I like to do is I like to write out what are the consequences to what just happened. You gave an example, like the child gives an example, and you've noticed it's backhanded bullying. Well, what happened after that? The kids were laughing at me, and what happened next? How did you feel about it? How did they feel, right? See if any of it comes about, if there's any more awareness about the consequences of the actions, right? So that they're more aware of it. And then standing up for themselves, I mean, that's a way of, again, how do you present when it's happening? If it's backhanded bullying, that's the real concern. It's not engaging in that backhanded bullying. It's having another strategy of what the child can say and how they can avoid kind of staying in that situation. You know, they know if they know it's happening, it's time to leave that situation.
Okay. Keep the questions coming. I do want to move into prevention because I think there's some really good. We do have professionals on the line, whether it be healthcare professionals or teachers. Can you talk about some prevention tips for professionals?
So in terms of prevention, well, one is really, I mentioned before about the different rates and the high rates. So if we know bullying's happening, to really keep an eye out. This isn't just for health professionals, frankly, it's for professionals in general. But we know that there are high rates, and make other people aware. You know, have these conversations. I'm so glad I can be here to do this because the more we can share and pay it forward, essentially, and have these conversations, the more we're going to notice things happening at the start, at the beginning. So that's prevention, right? It's still prevention. It happens a little, that's preventing it from happening a lot. So I think that's really important. As well, to talk, you know, parents talking with educators and educators talking amongst each other, that if we're trying to address bullying for a kid with ASD, that's not special treatment. That's what we're doing because this student is experiencing a bullying situation. Right. And that's across the board. We want to do that for any student in our classroom environments.
Okay, so when it comes to, I mean, we've talked about the parents and we've talked about the professionals. Let's review the children, right? Because they're the ones that are out there experiencing it. What are some prevention tips for children?
Well, if we're going to talk about prevention for kids, there's four real ones for any child with ASD included, that we want to cover. One is, we know that the better somebody is in terms of their social skills, so that's being assertive, all of the eye contact, communicating in a healthy way, for example, the less likely they are to experience bullying, and the more connected they are with peers, right, in terms of having friends, for example, or even having positive peer networks. Right, in their not Facebook networks, but real social networks, the less likely they are to experience bullying.
On that note, we had a question come in asking that if positive peers or peers in general can be part of that team you discussed. Does that ever happen? You ever see that happen?
Yeah, so kids, there are natural leaders in classrooms, right? There are students who are who have a lot of social capital, if you will. And having those kids with social capital aligned with the child who's being victimized really does help often with addressing the problem. Really, the most powerful thing that peers can do is not engage with the bullying, not just simply be a bystander.
Yes.
Help peers in general when they notice bullying, and then stand up for the child. You know, most of the time, Dr. Pepler talks about this, is most of the time there are bystanders around when bullying is happening, and when they start to intervene, within 10 seconds, you know, the majority of the time bullying decreases or stops.
Yeah.
Right? Peers have a lot of power overall, especially those who have a lot of social capital, positive power.
Next up on the list is fostering a positive classroom environment.
Sure, so there's cultures at schools, so different classrooms have different cultures within the same school. Different schools have different cultures across schools, so how we as educators model our relationships with other adults and how we model our relationships with kids, that trickles down to how kids interact with each other.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that our environments are really safe and respectful, because if we can send those positive messages forward, that's preventative. As well, home, right? What we do and how we relate to our loved ones at home, kids learn about those relationships. Kids, and they'll pass that on at school. So a positive environment is really important. And lastly is planning on the playground. Okay, we know this is a high-risk situation. Can we put activities in there? Can we ensure that supervision is there, right? So that it's not as unstructured, that there are things that children know what they're doing. They're not wandering around, you know, waiting for something to happen.
With a target on their back.
They're looking, they're already going to do something actively. Right. The more structured it is like that, the less likely there is to be the bullying.
Right. Unstructured time is where we see it the most, you were saying.
That's right.
Right. Got a question here. If a child with ASD is not being bullied, is it a good idea to go through these activities and the strategy so they're prepared if it does happen? Or might this cause anxiety for them and make them look for things that aren't there?
That's a great question, actually one that hasn't come up before in our discussions. I've only approached using these strategies individually with children when it is a problem.
Right.
That is the non-prevention ones, the other ones.
Yeah.
When it comes to what I would do with kids, if it's not a problem, is to focus on the prevention piece.
Right.
Is to focus on building those networks, on increasing those social skills. Keep that going. There's a lot, obviously, working for that child in that environment. So the question is, how do we maintain this and improve it even more, rather than necessarily, so again, they can be part of that classroom approach to bullying, education and bullying prevention, and the school-wide approach to it.
Yeah.
They don't need that individual one-on-one necessarily.
But as parents, I guess awareness is never a bad thing, maybe not about looking for bullying for themselves, but to see it when it's happening to others.
And I'm sure there's lots of resources in terms of books out there, things that kids can read with their parents around bullying. So not keeping it on them and talking about what are your experiences like, but reading books that are developmentally appropriate. Right? That talk about bullying and how people solve those problems, right? There are videos as well, the same thing, you know, after school special type videos where kids can watch it with their family members, and if a discussion comes up, that's great, but it's not focused on the child in the hot seat. Right.
Well, John, I got one more question, and then I got to apologize to the audience. I think I got too wrapped up in the conversation today, and we went a little bit long. But my daughter is 5 years old. Her school does a lot of bullying prevention workshops, which is good. She often interprets regular peer behavior, like not wanting to participate in a specific game, as bullying. Yeah. She tells us kids are bullying all the time, when we know in the majority of cases this isn't true.
Yeah.
She has advanced verbal skills for her age. Any advice on how to talk to her about this?
So this often happens a lot, and there's a concern that this girl has around how her peers are reacting to her. So it's still about responding sensitively, but not about filling out the templates that we talked about before, right? So again, it's an individual case, and I'd have to think more about this child in particular. But I think that recognizing and helping the child sort through why is she saying it's bullying, right? And what part of it is bullying and what part isn't, and what else could it be, right, might be helpful. There's a book we went over because of the time, but Nick Dubin wrote a pretty accessible book called Bullying in ASD, or maybe it's ASD and Bullying. And in there's lots of different strategies. It's really written for parents and educators, and I think this actually comes up in his book, is how do you talk to children who might be saying that they are being bullied when everybody else is recognizing there's a social issue going on, but nobody else is calling it bullying. How are you still sensitive to that child's experience?
And on that note, when you download the PowerPoint, which is available in the resource section, there's a few slides that take some role plays that parents can do as they relate to bullying from that book by Dubin, and I'm sure the information is easily accessible. We are out of time, so I want to give you an opportunity to basically surmise what we did today, and maybe leave everyone with a final thought.
Right. So my final thought is one that I do believe, even though we have some kind of negative numbers there, that bullying is an addressable problem when we take a team approach. Right. I've seen it change over time within the same school and across schools. So we can address this for individuals with ASD. And we can do it by thinking about what we can do proactively before a problem emerges, and after we've noticed that it's there. Both, I think, are very important, and we all have a role to play: professionals, parents, and youth in the process. The last thing I would like to say is, I mentioned my blog before, and there's another lay summary that's related to this on that blog, as well as other pieces of research-related information that families would also want to see. So the number's up.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you all for participating. Once again, the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer today, we are going to respond to in an FAQ. That's a good time to remind you that this presentation will be archived in its entirety on the Autism Ontario website in the coming days. When it is archived, it'll be alongside a number of other very insightful Autism Ontario webinars that all deal with topics around ASD that are be probably useful for similar audiences. All that being said, I know we're running late, so I want to thank you for your time today, and we'll see you here at the next Autism Ontario webinar.